Very happy to see you all. Okay, see we're moving screens here. Here we go. So I'm really I'm really grateful to be here, even though these are not the conditions that Ben suggested when you reached out with the invitation. And so I think we're all on the same page that for the kind of conversations we're hoping to have and the kinds of inquiries that you all certainly seem to be interested in, it's important to have face-to-face and actual communication. I've spent a lot of time reading psychoanalysis in my career and in my life, and I am big on that there are just all kinds of nonverbal cues that you can't get on this flattened screen. So we'll do the best we can. I'm really happy to be here. I was just sending up a shout out to little Richard, whom I just learned passed away. Seems like we're losing a lot of great artists and musicians these days. It's particularly difficult given the times. I'm really grateful for the invitation and for reaching out about it. I live in Columbus, Ohio. I've been at Ohio State now for, I think I just finished my 11th year. And before that, I was in a philosophy department in Austin, Texas. So to give you a little background on where I'm coming from in relation to how I understand where all of you are, I was raised Catholic and went to Notre Dame as an undergrad, where I studied what is still known as the Great Books curriculum. So I'm pretty steeped in Western culture, philosophy, and literature. From there, I went to graduate school in philosophy, where I studied and specialized in European philosophy. So it's unlike a lot of other philosophy that's taught in the United States in universities. It's not the analytic sort that's rooted in argumentation and such. It's much more rooted in European explorations. So I think for the conversation I'm hoping to have or initiate with you all today, the important part about that, right, is that it's I've done a lot of work on 20th century French philosophy, which is really raising, in relation to some of the ways I get what you guys are doing, it's raising the question of the limits of reason as much as it is the Enlightenment project and the power of reason itself. I don't think it's a surprise that as a chair of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies department, I am concerned about our political climate these days. And so in some ways, given what I see to be the global rise of the authoritarian right, it seems like a very good time to just come back to the regular power of reason and not concern ourselves quite so much about the limits of reason. So I see you guys are smiling, you get what I'm saying. But to follow that out, I think in terms of the trajectory of my work, I did move into a Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies department, which is an interdisciplinary department. It's been very enlivening because I think the complexity of problems we have need all kinds of angles and methodologies. Across 20th century European philosophy, French and German philosophy, you see a real concern with the limits of reason in relation to violence. And particularly the event that overshadows all that work is World War II and the kind of violence that the world saw there. And so as I began to emerge into my own writing, which was a while, I published my first book, I think 10 or 12 years after I got my PhD. I really took that question of violence in particular directions. And so my first book is called Queering Freedom, and it really is on the way that sexuality and race feed each other, and how we always have to think about those together, but also on questions of desire and pleasure, and especially also the questions of temporality. I was really concerned with how we're always thinking about some future that will somehow make things better. It's more of the progress narrative, and whether in fact we can hang on to that. As I moved further along, and my most recent book is called Way Too Cool, The Selling Out of Race and Ethics. I was really trying to take up the question of neoliberalism and think about it as a social phenomenon, not just an economic and political phenomenon. So I was really trying to think through how our understanding of social differences, especially things like race, also sexuality and gender and class, and ability, have changed since the 1980s, and how really we have less an ability or capacity to make ethical arguments about those things. And so a lot of that work was taking up this notion of cool as something that has sort of bastardized our ability to understand the historical problems that those categories signal, especially the category of race. So since that time, I have gone much deeper into the question of race itself. I have now just really focused on that in a pretty intensive way. And I also made a decision in 2015 to begin trying to uproot myself a bit from the European tradition. And so I'm really steeped in there, and that's never going to end. We can't undo those kinds of habits and patterns. But I really have made a concerted effort to try to read and think alongside what I mostly refer to as the radical Black tradition and radical Black studies. I also have a number of thinkers out of Latin America. And so as a person who is white and who identifies as white and who is identified in the world, more importantly, when I'm in the world, I'm read first and foremost as a white person. I really have become convinced that to think through the position we're in as white folks in this global situation, that we need to listen to people who are not white, that they have a great deal to tell us, and also just to hear sort of some of those other voices. So my suggestion, after a little bit of a back and forth with both Ben and Carl, was to look at Sylvia Winter and maybe to introduce you to her work. I don't know if you know her work. And it seemed like she might be a person that you all would find interesting to pursue. So I'm just going to say a few things, and then I hope we can open it up and have conversation, because I really am a dialogical thinker. I'm not a lecturer. So I'm just going to pause there and see if there's anything to chat on before I just launch into a little bit of an overview of Sylvia Winter's work.
Are you able to say anything more about this, our lack of capacity to make ethical arguments? And as we're kind of moving into what will kind of, I'm assuming, be a little bit of an ethical argument, I'm curious about that dichotomy.
Yeah, and I'm happy to just stay there, right? We can just talk about where we are in the contemporary moment if that's what we want to do, or maybe we can circle back. Whatever you all want to do is really what I'm up for today. So one of the easiest ways to think about this is to take up the power of the discourse of colorblindness and the way that has traveled across, it seems to me, across all kinds of political spectrums and the political ideologies. You're on the left, you're on the right, you're in the center, wherever you are. And it travels into Europe as well. It's connected to the 80s and the language of multiculturalism. And so you begin to see, right, if you think about the late 20th century in the United States, right, you have the civil rights movement, which is an ethical movement, right? And people understand that the stakes of the civil rights movement is an ethical situation. And then whether we get progress out of that or we don't is, of course, a big debate, right? Whether certainly we get some kinds of legal progress out of that movement. As we move into the 80s, the kind of ethical argument where you would actually make reference to, for example, if we stay with race, the long history of racism in the United States, which we know goes back at least 2, if not 5 centuries, right? That ability to make that argument begins to fade out of public discourse. And so my argument is, it has a lot to do with neoliberalism, which I'd be happy to chat about what I think neoliberalism is up to and what it means to think about it socially and not just economically and politically. But when we start talking about multiculturalism, it begins to be that differences, right? You get this command to celebrate diversity. So suddenly we move from the civil rights, where we know that differences signal a historical past that's connected to injustice and violence. And then in the 80s and 90s, we begin to get this command like, oh, social difference is just something cool. It's cool to say you have a Black friend. It's cool to say you have a gay friend or a genderqueer friend or whomever it might be. And so what I argue there is social difference becomes a kind of cool accoutrement instead of something that still signals this long historical violence. And this is connected to, and we can see this, I see it in university classrooms all the time, although it is changing, I think now, this kind of abrupt brushing off of the meaning of history in relation to these things, right? It's like, oh, don't drag me back into the past. I can't pay for the sins of my forefathers. We're pushing forward. We're in a good space. Come on, you're a downer, whatever that might be. That's all connected up with the ability to make ethical arguments, because unless we can really address, seems to me, my argument is, unless we can really not only address in an intellectual way, but unless we can actually feel, right? Actually get it, like in our guts, what that long history has been and how it worked and how it is persistent through the systems that we have, then we aren't going to have ethical traction, right? And a lot of my concern is a psychoanalytic concern. I have worked a lot in psychoanalysis, which is neither here nor there, but the issue here is that we have to connect to it, right? The psychoanalytic term is cathexis, which means to get it, to feel it, not just it to be an argument we understand rationally. It has to be both. But when you think about the cultural representations we have, right, not many of them are pushing us in that direction.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Anything else or anything? I don't know that I can see the chat or the Q&As. I don't know if there's stuff.
Yeah, no, we don't have anything yet, but.
Okay. Okay, well, I'm happy to forge forward with Sylvia Winter if that's of interest to y'all. That was what I just sort of pitched out there.
Yeah.
But I also know you talked some, Ben, about moving into other communities and the question of white saviorism. I think those are real issues.
Yeah. I from what I understand of Winter's work, I think we can easily dovetail some of her writings into kind of some of our larger concepts, questions.
Okay, sure. Well, I will give a brief overview then of the piece that I think is provocative, right? It's a piece that she kind of throws out, and I'm always curious about it. So given what I heard from you all just on the website, I thought it might be interesting. So Sylvia Winter is a Jamaican descent, a Jamaican citizen who moves into the United States and is a literary theorist, really mostly across the 70s and 80s. And not many people read her until really the 90s and the aughts, when a lot of Black scholars start to read her. And then she has really burst onto a broader scene in the last 5 years. So she is still alive. She's quite elderly. But a lot of people are giving attention to her. I just found, as I was preparing for this, a nice overview of some of her work in the New Inquiry. So it's an essay there. I'd be happy to send you guys that link if you're interested in it. She works in a really expansive, big kind of world systems way, which is what a lot of what are called decolonial theorists do. And so the piece of the argument that I'm curious about is this argument she has around the Renaissance. And so she takes us all the way back to the 15th century, which is where most Black and Latino thinkers are these days, because for them, it's the 15th century when the transatlantic slave trade begins and when colonialism emerges, that those are the spaces that we need to anchor ourselves in more deeply. So she gives this incredible reading of the European Renaissance, right? And I don't know about you all, but my training taught me that the European Renaissance was the great space when humanism emerges, and that humanism is the vehicle for progress. and it was a kind of move against authoritarian, against the authority of the church, right? A break from the authority of the church, and a move towards a secularist and even rationalist project, which would come to fruition, I think, in the Enlightenment. So against that very mainstream story, Winter really encourages us to think about it in relation to the Portuguese ships, right, that are setting sail in 1415. And they're setting sail mostly for the north coast of Africa. It's the beginning of the slave trade and of colonialism. And in a big, broad stroke, her argument is that what we begin to see there is this emergence of the figure human that is not only, right? It's not that it's in lieu of, but it's not only in relation to the authority of the church. It is also has to be thought in relation to this discovery of other worlds. And so thinking that through leads her to begin to talk about the human in relation to the emergence of the category of Black. And so it alters all our meanings of secularism, right? Because suddenly to claim human is certainly to claim rational and those good things, but it is also to claim a kind of what we would now call European supremacy, European superiority, which was bolstering up this capacity to do the kinds of explorations and the kinds of political and economic, systems that emerge out of that. So she coins these terms. They're called, in her phrases, they're called man one and man two. And man one is the one that emerges in the 15th century, which she really does call Homo politicus, right? It's a political animal who emerges. So what she's wanting to say is Renaissance humanism is not just this other story we all know. It is also a political vehicle to get these systems into movement, okay? She then goes on to talk about man two, which is a 19th century figure that she really roots in the changes brought by Darwin and capitalism, which she calls that a bioeconomic subject. And that's really more who we're living inside of now. So that's kind of the broad schematic. The provocative thing that gets laced into all of that is she draws on this other theorist, Aníbal Quijano, who really wants to say, who just kind of tosses out this idea that in that transformation from theology into the human and across this figure of man one and man two is the same structure. So the theology of Christianity that is there in the figure of authority pre-Renaissance, right? The God. That structure of authority, what I would always say, and what I was always taught, right, is that structure of authority shifts to the authority of reason. Mm-hmm. What she is arguing, along with Aníbal Quijano, is that there may be something interesting thinking about how that structure of theology, the structure of God, shifts into the concept of race. And so that's where I think the provocation is, right? Is to get, and I haven't seen anyone really take this up and try to run with it. And to me, it's like, oh, what is this? It seems so interesting to me to try to unpack what that would really mean to think that through. Because that means that the concept of race is what's holding the human in place, right? In this story. If the human is emerging as a way to subtend the systems of slavery and colonialism, and it's coding for European, really, then it's curious to me how race is functioning as the authoritative concept that keeps those systems in place. So that's the provocation. put differently, right? If we have, I drew this little schematic. I was like, oh, I should have a visual. I really should have a visual. I don't know if this will work. Probably not. But, you know, it is that if you think about the typical Renaissance story, then you have God, right? And pre-Renaissance, right? In sort of Orthodox Christian theology of that early period. You have God and man, right? And man is the fallen, sinful person. What comes to replace that in man one is that you have human, which is really coding for European, right? And this is black, right? Or heathens. In man two, when biology gets rolling, you have human and you have raced others, which post-Darwin is known as defective, like biologically and evolutionarily defective. And so there's a way that it begins to make sense that the concept that's ruling this, right, is still structurally the same in some ways as it was in the theological setup.
I feel like I
That's
need
my
a
pitch
moment
for
to
you guys.
digest all of that. For
It was Saturday morning fodder we were going for here, so. Yeah, so that's what Winter's up to. She's up to a lot of things too, and I can talk about those if you want me to ramble on, but I think that's plenty for us to try to unpack.
I guess one of the things that your comments are raising to mind for me is work of some of the liberation psychologies, philosophies, and that sort of things. The Paulo Freire's of, you know,
Right.
coming alongside the oppressed. And so I don't know where that goes, to be honest. But you know, if we accept the setup of the defective other, which language is itself fully loaded in so many different ways. I guess I'm curious, and maybe this connects some of to this white savior question of things, is how do we, as a largely white community, a largely people who highly value rationalism and reason and the Enlightenment, engage in this coming alongside? I think of it as and maybe this language is itself loaded, a rehumanizing of these people that have been seen as defective.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that it opens up, and I love that you bring in Freire or you know, liberation theology, right, which has such a huge play in Latin America alongside neoliberalism in some not so good ways, is that I think it opens up and forces the path that the European, and thereby I mean also North American, right? And so it may just be more helpful to call it white. That the white normativity of what it is to be human may not be the only path towards being human.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, one of the things is that she does a lot of great work with Frantz Fanon. And if you guys haven't read Frantz Fanon, I would always recommend reading Fanon. Black Skin, White Mask is a remarkable book. And Fanon introduced this figure of the damned. And the damned is like this inchoate kind of mass of like mess of like, well, who is that, right? So if the voice of reason and the voice of human is in some way, if we take Winter's provocation that the voice of the human may have a kind of white superiority built into it, then it does open up, which is about the white saviorism issue, right? To the real need, but also opportunity that when we, in our best of intentions, want as white folks to go into non-white, in this segregated world, right, into non-white spaces to help, that the condition for doing that has to be vulnerability and openness and listening and humility, because what we need to do more than anything is hear something that we're not hearing, because we've been so trained up to just hear what we already want to, you know, what we think the rational thing is to hear. So it's messy and it's super open-ended. It's super, I do think vulnerability is one of the real takeaways of, and I don't think that's easy for us. Like, we can sit here on our little Zoom chat and say, oh yeah, let's make ourselves vulnerable. But when you actually go into the world and then you're going to chat about things and then things are going to emerge and you're thinking, what? This is not how it should be. And you're not going to say that?
Yeah, and I mean, that connects to a lot of my, and Carl, if other questions are popping up, you know, feel free to interrupt me.
Yeah, no, I'm still digesting.
Okay. The work that I do as a humanist chaplain and training chaplains is a lot of this training towards vulnerability, towards openness of, the way I talk about it is our stories, the way our stories are impacting how we hear other people's stories and how we engage in their stories. And internally for me, there's always been this wrestling of, I guess, the value of reason and this, what is often seen as this like Spockian, like Mr. Spock, and emotions are, you know, at worst when they come to the surface, instead of engaging them as a part of who we are as a human being. So this engaging vulnerability almost as a, I guess I'm hearing it as a power play, or almost an assertive force against some of this rational, some of this more concept of race and God, and this this joining of others, again, not in this like I know best because I'm clearly an upper class middle white, you know, white person, versus let me hear about what your actual values are and how you are living into this world, and how we can be a part of that with you.
I take that to be a pretty radical political and ethical move.
Which is that?
What you're describing.
Yeah.
I think what you're describing, and that I take that to be both a radical political and radical ethical move, because it is cutting it so far against the grain of everything that Western culture has trained us to think of ourselves. I mean, we are so much brought up under the idea of white benevolence, and that that despite the horrors of the past, we have seen our way through it. We've seen our way through it rationally, and we know better now. And so now we are benevolent. And certainly, you know, this is not easy to sort out given the pandemic we're in, right? Where I think the nakedness of what are being called vulnerable populations is so stark and so upsetting. So certainly there is a sharing of material goods that seems like that's still a good idea. But everything else you're describing, I think, is a pathway that's opening up to walk through, to kind of undo some of these deeper habits of whiteness that we have, and really linking up those habits with secular rationalism is one of the pinpoints that Sylvia Winter really works on. Yeah.
All right. We had a question. So this is from Ben Withman. It says, it seems to me that the theology goes along with the ideas of racial superiority, I don't think that it was replaced by it. I think that one reason the European colonial powers thought they were superior to non-white people is that they believed they possessed the true religion, while the colonized were mired in the error of their false beliefs. What are your thoughts on this?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that that's right on, and I think that the way that that played out, right, especially in the United States and North America, was pretty horrifying in relation to the genocide of Native Americans. And there are stories. There's a really great book called The Racial Contract by Charles Mills. It was written in 1992 or so. Super book. And he goes on about precisely this issue and how appalling it was to see in the historical record that when the Spanish priests came, right, as part of the colonizing forces into this continent, they would in fact convert the Native Americans as a condition of their colonizing. So it was Christianity was certainly part of the civilizing mission. The horrifying part was that to do so, they insisted that the Native Americans swear an oath. It was called the requerimento, whereby the entire thing was read to Native indigenous peoples in Spanish.
They were expected to swear that oath.
They did.
Yeah.
It was that or get killed, probably. So that's absolutely true that it was built into the Christian thinking. That's right. But I think the push, so just to push that a little further, is to say, yeah, okay, it was, but then you move to the secularist position and you're like, well, we got rid of all that Christian stuff because we broke free and we're rational. And what Winter's saying is, no, that move itself is the move that we need to be worried about. Is that still part of the ongoing white supremacy project, basically? So I agree. There's no doubt that it's built into Christianity and that Christianity is a huge part of the civilizing benevolence that actually is quite violent. But it's also the case that she's pushing it harder to say that the move towards human, away from God and away from Christianity, is still carrying its own problems, because it's still set up in relation to the heathen, and then later in 19th century forms to the defective. And whatever it is, it could even, if you just take it in capitalism, right? It's always, or I think of George Bush the first, right? Who was where we got the phrase, we're making the world safe for democracy. So whether it's Christianity or civilization or democracy or science or reason, all of these things are part of the white progress narrative that casts us as benevolent, and all of that is getting cast into doubt.
Yeah, I think a part of my own experience into the rational humanist side of things is almost, I think this maybe is a little bit of what Winter's talking about, this new colonialization of reason and like we discarded the theology of our past, which you know, I think that is an accurate explanation of kind of how I got into humanism, but also almost seeking an evangelistic oppression of our own rationalism into those people for whom some level of religion or spirituality is still very meaningful and important to them.
Right. Right. So you're a skeptic of the evangelical impulse that can take on a lot of different guises.
Yeah.
And that may be a way to talk about it too, right? That the issue is what does it mean to be evangelical? What kind of stance of certainty and security do you stand in, or do you assume, in order to take on that kind of voice? The voice of enlightening others, right?
Yeah.
You're assuming your own certainty in some ways.
And I'm also saying this in my, mindful that my presentation last month was about sort of um, a taking over of language of religion and spirituality in more secular and humanist terms,
Yeah.
In almost a way of saying we can create a quote unquote better understanding of this language that is more useful, which may or may not be. I mean, as I'm talking about it, it smacks a little bit of this own overtaking of.
Yeah, I mean, I think that things are so complex at this point, right? I mean, things are just super complex in our interconnected, globalized world. And I do think that there are different kinds of languages that are useful and fruitful for different kinds of groups and communities.
Mm-hmm.
And so in part of my turn, right, my next project that I'm working on in very early stages is really on whiteness, because it does strike me that the more I read all this radical Black tradition, there's a whole school of thought called Afro-pessimists that I'm super interested in. But it's clear to me that white people need to be working with white people on the problem of whiteness.
Mm-hmm.
And that we tried to do that back in the 90s in some ways, and it kind of failed because it became just an excuse not to deal with the problem. It was like, oh, we can talk about ourselves again. And it's not that. It's like, okay, we get it. We get that there are huge problems in this world, that the disparities of just if you talk about it in terms of economic disparities, that they are grossly racialized. And we can kind of intuitively get that that might track all the way back to the 5 centuries of colonialism and slavery that we have been the beneficiaries of in a variety of ways. Fine. This means that there is a need for us to sort this through. Mm-hmm. And there is increasingly, and I did it with my students this semester, and whoa, did it make them nervous. It made them so nervous. And then we chatted through why it was making us so nervous. But twice, when we were still in person, I broke them into racially segregated groups. I said, this is what we're going to do, because white people need to learn how to talk with each other about these problems. And people of color don't need to sit around and hear us do this homework. They're in a different conversation. Mm-hmm. And it was explosive. Pedagogically, it was explosive. They all got it and they ran forward. They did say that, it took a lot of trust, that you have to build trust in order to do that. And that if some other instructor in some, in a math class came in and said, we're going to racially segregate, it would pull off all the other bells, So that's a long answer. But to come back to what you're saying, what I hear you saying, Ben, is that I'm not sure what your work as a humanist chaplain is, but it certainly is intriguing to me. And it does seem to me that we can't allow, it doesn't help any of us to allow organized religion to have the only purchase on spirituality.
That's helpful. I mean, that's kind of a part of, what I guess I was going at, and from your work, just the language of authentically different, I think you talked about at one point in Queering Freedom, and trying to balance that out. And I don't know how that feeds into this per se, but yeah.
Yeah.
So we've got another question. This comes more reads more as a statement, but I'll put it out there anyways. The idea of white race as God and the sense of framing value systems has come to my attention forcefully recently with the shooting of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. Do the white vigilantes have a special privilege to determine when they can confront a black jogger with guns? May black vigilantes confront white joggers in the same way?
Yeah. It's pretty horrifying. I mean, the nakedness of it is just so, like, where are we? Are we in the 50s again? I don't know where we are. I really don't know where we are. I mean, the boldness that I mean, I don't know you guys very well, so I'm not sure where all of you are standing in the political spectrum, but it's so charged. And just the images of, I mean, that shooting is just, to me, it's actually not very surprising. But the other image that goes alongside that is the image of all the armed protesters in Michigan. Just like the amount of what's the word I'm looking for? Just oh, it's slipping my tongue. The word of just feeling like you own it all, right? Just that it's yours.
Yeah.
Right.
Chutzpah came to mind for me. Chutzpah came
yeah,
to mind for me.
yeah. That would be a good other word to use. But the point, right? I so much of my Twitter feed, which is largely out of what I call Black Twitter, was like, let's compare this to some of the protests around Black Lives Matter. If Black folks lined up with guns like that in front of a state house, they would be in prison in 2 hot seconds.
Prison would be the best result.
Yes, this is going to say,
that's right.
or much
that's
worse.
Right. And so I think we have to think of it all as a piece, because this latest atrocity coming to mind, you know, I don't understand why it's taken 2 months for this to come to light. I think there's a whole backstory there that the Root is one of my favorite media outlets, has really been thinking about. But nonetheless, whenever these things come up, it's important for us, right? If we're taking an anti-racist, an actively anti-racist ethical stance, to be sure we don't treat it as an exception. There was nothing exceptional about what happened in Georgia, even though it's deeply, deeply upsetting. But it's all of the same piece. And so, to be clear, what Winter is saying about the transformation from God to race is that the concept of race and the work it does in our world, right, is holy. It's a work that's sacred in the way that the work of God was to the pre-Enlightenment world, where we can't imagine the world without it. If we didn't have it, the world would crumble. That's what I take to be some of the implications of this provocation. So I think a lot about, I don't know, have you all ever read Feuerbach? Is Feuerbach anything?
I have not.
Very interesting bios up on your website, all I have to say, and I read them all. And a lot of you seem to work through religious upbringings through just like incredibly perseverant work on the Bible, which I, as a Catholic, I applaud and am mystified by. But Feuerbach's an interesting late 19th century German thinker who does amazing work on the concept of faith and God, because he just makes the point that God exists because humans so badly need God to exist, and that doesn't undercut the existence, right? It's like you can see that it's a rational trick, like from rationality you can see, oh, it's a trick we're playing on ourselves, but at a deeper kind of, whatever we want to call that, psychological, spiritual, whatever it might be, ethical need, we need that. And that's what perpetuates its on. So now substitute the word race instead of God. We need it. If we don't have it, So.
Yeah, that does feel very provocative, but it also feels so massive, like it's almost overwhelming, like that concept of things.
Yeah. I mean, I do think, so Sylvia Winter writes these impossible essays, because they are neither books nor essays. They're all like 80 and 90 pages long. The joke I make with students is that she actually did the thing that I didn't think another writer could do. She writes sentences that are longer than Immanuel Kant. Her sentences are just massively long. And so my point is, her writing style itself demands this kind of slow, meditative kind of thinking. It's not super like here's an analytic argument and we're going to work it out. It's much more like, ooh, you get inside there and you have to go slow. And I think that's what it takes to really begin to think through this kind of challenge that she's putting forward, that without race, that race holds a place in our world similar to the concept of God. Yeah. So I'm just trying to entice you all to read her.
Yeah, you're doing good work.
She's super interesting. Frantz Fanon is her biggest thinking partner, I think. So if you want something that's still quite challenging, but also a little, anyhow, I really love Fanon's work. Can't say enough about that work.
You also, I don't know, in the humanism and race world of things, there's Anthony Penn from Rice University, who's sort of the writer on the side of things. And some of the concepts he talks about of, I'm thinking in particular in his book, like The End of God Talk, where he talks about that humanism is in fact a strong part of African American culture, and that we can still, he talks about an embodied humanist theology that is an African American embodied theist or humanist theology. And so some of these concepts of race and God, and he talks specifically about like keeping the term of theology and theos, but removing God from the definition of this theos and putting it into this lived, for him, this lived African American experience, which seems to parallel a lot of kind of what you're talking about here today.
Yeah, I appreciate the recommendation. Not aware of that at all. Sounds super interesting. Sounds very interesting. I mean, I will say that this is the other tricky piece of immersing myself much more in Black and decolonial studies, is that the audience that they're writing for is never me. And I think that's good. It's good not to be centered. It's good not to assume, oh, they're speaking my language, they're speaking to my problems, they're speaking to my way of thinking. And so it's always like, whoa, okay, again, that vulnerability, that humility, like it's not for me, it's for someone else. And it's always written for different things, right? Audre Lorde is one of my favorite thinkers to read, and she always makes it clear that she's writing for survival and the survival of her people, African Americans. And it strikes me that we white folks are rarely writing for survival. If we are writing for survival, it's the survival of the individual. And we might have our own trials. I'm not going to say that. We have our trials, we have our struggles, but so much of the tradition of existentialism was about the individual's death.
Yeah.
Whereas for so many Black writers, it's about genocide. It's about the death of the race. It's about the death of communities. So it's a much more collective kind of undertaking, not an individualistic undertaking. The individual is another kind of core concept that a lot of us have to rewire and rethink.
Carl, I really like Randall's question. I kind of want to go on a different tangent, but I think we need to get to Randall's question too.
All right. So Randall asks, does this concept of race as God apply in non-Western societies, and how does it play out there, for example, in India?
What a big question. I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that the religious traditions of India are so at odds. The only other traditions that I know that are that at odds are sort of the deep traditions of East Asia, at odds with monotheism, is what I wanted to get to. This is rooted I think in religions that are monotheistic. So I think the connections with Islam are interesting to think through. but not with Hinduism. You know, Hinduism is such an incredibly polyvalent, because it's polytheistic, kind of religious tradition. And the notion of race is not nearly as forceful there, if at all, as is the notion of caste.
Mhm.
So it's caste that carves up social power there so powerfully, right? The untouchables and the I'm forgetting the name of the other really lower class, but it's a caste system. It's not a race system. So I think it's safe to say no, that this is really rooted in European Renaissance, in European derived cultures. That said, given the globalization of our moment, I do think the concept of race has traveled in remarkable ways. So that, again, speaking to my interactions with students, Ohio State used to have, I don't think we will continue to have for a while, a large number of Chinese students. And it was remarkable to have conversations with Chinese students around the concept of race, because I think the immediate impulse is to say, oh, our culture doesn't have that. And then they would really get inside it and listen to what we were talking about in terms of these long structures of supremacy and this kind of adoration of a white aesthetic and a European aesthetic. And many of them came to see, oh, wait, given the onslaught of popular culture, it is there. So India is a very particular place where I think this does not apply because of, Hinduism mostly. And because of the place India stands in colonialism, right? I mean, they're the colonized. And so there's that begs the question, right? I mean, they definitely love British, and they continue to be a fairly Anglophile culture. So I think in broad strokes, no, but there's always something to think further about there in relation to the history of colonialism and what colonial liberation has and has not really looked like in India.
This does raise for me the question of the value of light skin in the Indian culture, like the propensity of products that are there to lighten one's skin. And we had very close friends from Mumbai who were very concerned that their daughter not spend a lot of time outside lest she get too dark.
That's right. That's right.
So, I mean, I don't know if that's particular race or, maybe more sort of leftover vestiges of colonialism and that Anglophile side of things.
Which would be both, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and that exists in Black communities too here in the United States. And it's called out by a lot of Black feminist scholars as just colorism. But also Latinx cultures also have this a lot. So there is a kind of eerie global preference for white aesthetics that should give us all pause. Whether Winter's exact schematic can apply to all of that, I would think not, right? I like Sylvia Winter a lot. I think she's provocative, but when it finally comes to the end of the day, she's at this super meta level. And ultimately, when we get into questions like this, it's like, well, let's get some more details on the ground, right? Let's be a little more specific about the cultures and the differences we're talking about here. But yeah, it's a great question.
So your comments of existentialism and the individual raised for me one of my favorite philosophers being Simone de Beauvoir, sort of the first wave feminist existentialist writers who, you're obviously familiar with her as you're nodding your head, this idea of, one is not born a woman, but is made one. And this idea of, as I read her, taking sort of that existentialist ideal of freedom and the individual and putting it within the context of the inescapability almost of the culture within which that person is being
Yeah.
raised in or a part of.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's where French philosophy is at its best in the 20th century, right? I mean, because it really is a sense that we are materially bound to our cultures in ways that we can't get out of. And Beauvoir opens up she opens up the issue of sexual difference. So of course that's huge, and that's a route we haven't taken to talk about here, but I'd always be happy to talk about. But it also really pushes on how far you really can jump out of your culture's skin, you know? And I think where I am at this point, after a lot of years of thinking on these things, is I'm just much more interested in the collective than the individual effort to do so. So what would it mean to like bond together as white persons and collectively try to undo whiteness? That's such an interesting and a non-white way of thinking about it, right? Because we always want it to be, the individual is so bound up with how we think. Yeah, so much of existentialism and Beauvoir moves that target a lot, but so much of it is such a romantic, and by that I mean like a technically part of romanticism, obsession with one's own mortality. And that strikes me as the hallmark of well, I'll just be blunt with you guys, since I've been here, I've been chatting with you, or I've been chatting at you for an hour. I mean, that's the hallmark of a white male attitude, right? Yeah. It's all about my mortality. It's like, well, what kind of privileged place are you that you can just worry about your own mortality all day? Most people don't get that privilege, right? Most people are more, as my mom always told me, like, that philosophy is all good and everything, but we were mostly just worried about getting a food on the plate and food on the table and a roof on our heads. So that, again, that Audre Lorde notion that so much of the Black experience is about Black survival. And it just comes through so powerfully these days in terms of a collective kind of movement. Black scholarship right now, just so I can toot that horn for a second, is on fire. The kinds of things that are being produced by Black scholars, I'm reading particularly Black feminists and Black female scholars, but across the board, is just unbelievably productive and creative. And a lot of it's written in a really beautiful, accessible form. So I just try to encourage that. So I'll ask you guys some questions because I'm just curious. So y'all meet monthly and you always chat about different topics, or you have threads, and do you ever read things together? Or I'm very happy to have stumbled upon.
Yes. So I would say it is a large group like this. We meet monthly, and then scattered throughout the month. I mean, we probably, well, pre-COVID, we met probably about a dozen times a month in smaller groups. Yeah, you know, like I will say, for better or worse, Meetup has actually been a powerful organizing force. You know, like if you track like how many events we had, that's really where it hit the ground running. So, you know, like that's kind of what I love about this community is we've got something for almost everybody. You know, we've got one of our board members took over. It used to be the book club, but they transformed it into a media club where it's you show up and you talk about whatever media you're consuming and you know, keep a log of that. We've got a lot of social events where people meet and, you know, like just usually congregate around food. That's how I came into the group, was running Skeptics in the Pub. and service opportunities. We have a group that goes out and serves meals to the homeless at the homeless shelter and picks up garbage. And, you know, then during the summer, we sometimes do hikes and canoeing and stuff like that. So it's pretty relatively diverse set of activities.
Yeah. Wow, kudos to all of you. I love hearing it. It's like seems like a really terrific social and intellectual formation that it's enlivening to hear about. It is.
Yeah, it is.
We have a lot of passive consumerist way of socializing in this world where it's like to have actual intentionality and to do it that often and to really feed so many different parts of yourselves is inspiring.
Yeah. But it is funny, even in this, you think at this point, for most people, you know, you live in Columbus, or most people live in Columbus. I live out in Madison County, so that's a whole other thing. But you know, even to this day, a lot of even skeptics in the pub, people will come and they just need a place to vent and be like, oh my God, all right, I'm here. Get it out, you know.
Yeah. But I love that. And in that way, it's something that that community, kind of intentional community, is to circle back to what Ben was saying earlier. It strikes me that we as a culture still haven't really rewired that beyond organized religion.
Yeah.
And that's what you're describing is a lot of what people get out of organized religion. Yeah. And yet a lot of us don't want to participate in organized religion. I know my partner and I been together like 24 years, and it's an ongoing concern. Like, well, where are we getting this? Because we're not getting it there. So it's inspiring to hear your success.
Yeah. Thanks. A part of what the board, I think, has been working on, and the part of why our curiosity, well, my personal curiosity and then energy to get you involved in our, you know, this talk today, is we kind of lost our main physical space, and as a board we've been wondering with the community, what does the next space look like for us? And what does it mean that we are a part of our Central Ohio community, and how do we want to live that out in our humanist values? So
interesting.
That's been a
so
part
you lost your physical space because
we were getting a really steal of a lease from the Secular Student Alliance, and they moved from Lumbus to LA, and then we ended up, you know, having to find plan B.
Interesting. And so how often do you use that space?
When we had it, we used it pretty frequently. And that actually, that was part of, there was some friction there with the company that managed the space, went under different management who wasn't quite as sympathetic or possibly passively antagonistic towards our goals. So we started using it less, but we still used it, you know, a couple times a month. And that's, you know, so part of what we started doing was after a series of moves, we started using the library system. I mean, it's the libraries in Central Ohio are fantastic, and you get the, you know, we finally just settled down, and then all this stuff happened and canceled all the events.
Well, once upon a time, Ohio State had a nice space related to the Humanities Institute, but we lost that space. You know, Ohio State has sold its soul to the banks. So we now lease our own space back from the university. That's the brilliant move that Ohio State made. We sold all of our energy to a company in Canada. And now we learned in the last year that the part of the fundamental deal there was that we would now lease our space back from that company. And it's on an escalating rent. So the Humanities Institute doesn't have much of a space, but should that ever come to be, I would be happy to chat with you if you wanted to try to use that space, but
Yeah.
I don't know that it would serve what you're really wanting.
We do have another question. This is a broad question, but do you find race distinctions or gender distinctions have a more powerful impact on how society functions?
Well, have you heard the term intersectionality?
I have.
I don't mean to be flippant, but I don't think we can think about them separately. So I don't think we can think about them separately. I think I am concerned about how intersectionality travels, but I do think the fundamental insight of that theory, which came out of legal studies, so it's rooted in the legal problem, is that we have to be able to think differences like race and gender, class, sexuality, ability, I would put religion and nation in there. We have to think about them as always intersected. So what it means to be a Black woman is very different from what it means to be a white woman. Those are two very different notions, two very different set of characteristics attached to femininity when a body is Black and when a body is white or when a body is Latinx. Just run through in your head the stereotypes that attach to each. They're very different. So I would never want to separate them out in that way. That said, I have made an argument over and over that there's a need to be able to look at them, to get at them more carefully in specificity. Because gender has its own fascinating kind of way of traveling, especially as trans and genderqueer and gender non-binary begin to grow and continue to grow in our own public spheres. The notions of what gender is and how gender operates is super important to understand. It's the root of our whole department's being. But those are never without race. They're always racialized, and race is always gendered. There's an argument that's made by an incredible person. I know I keep throwing out names, but Hortense Spillers is this incredible thinker, especially from the 80s and 90s. And she makes the argument that the binary gender system, that's you're either male or you're female, and that somehow, and you know, there's no in between. And all the horrors of that, right? The problems of that kind of strict binary system. She really tries to make the argument, and I think succeeds, that this is a tool of whiteness. That when you think about African cultures do not track along binary gender lines, at least pre-colonized. So they're complex things, but at the surface of it, I'd say they're always interconnected and really shaping each other. Because I took up gender, but you could go the other direction too. It's very different to be a Black man than a Black woman. And then if you get trans in there, you get a whole different kind of permutations. So I think about them always as intersecting and as mutually constituting each other. So are we out of steam here?
I feel like we're winding down. If anybody's got any questions, that was your last chance. I tend to, I'm better at math, so I take time to digest these things.
I think taking time is always a good idea. That's why I like seminars. We can all just kind of digest together.
Yeah. Yeah, I will say, I had a couple thoughts. Mostly lighthearted, but that is one of the things. I went to graduate school at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, and that's one of the things that I missed the most about living in that community was how diverse it was. I mean, you literally hear like 12 different languages in a day.
Yeah.
And I just haven't lived in a community where I had that sense. It was really awesome. And like along the lines of, replacing God with race or something else. That was one of the realizations I had. I came from a very, very conservative Christian upbringing. And, you know, when I moved over, first step was into skepticism, and then, you know, slowly into humanism. And it's funny how even in our community, I can still trace back the exact same personalities to church. You know, it's like, oh, I know that guy.
Yeah, that's funny.
It's you know,
Yeah.
the same beliefs, just same people, just different beliefs. You know, you just yank out one set of values and beliefs and pound another one. And it's, you know.
I mean, that gets at it, right? That gets at it. Like if that's what we're seeing, then maybe really things haven't changed that much. Like maybe we can push a little harder. Yeah.
Exactly.
No, it's a nice way of putting it. That makes sense. Yep.
All right. Well, Ben, did you have anything else?
I'm censoring myself. I could talk for hours.
Well, I could say honestly, I could sit and listen to you two talk for hours.
Well, I enjoyed it. So if you guys wanna do it again in the future, I'd be game.
Awesome.
Great.
Even better if we could do it in person.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But if
exactly.
not, I suppose we're all getting used to this format. But I'm always looking for ways to think about, and you all are like really wanting to think in a pretty complex way about these issues beyond the walls of the university. It's not easy to do that outside of our classrooms, you know, and that's, to me, that's really one of the places we are as a society. Like we need to keep pushing these things out beyond. These conversations need to be happening everywhere, not just in university spaces or in church spaces or synagogue or mosque spaces. So again, kudos to you guys, and thanks so much for inviting me and seeking that out. I really appreciate it. But happy. I hope we can stay in touch.
Yeah.
Yeah,
For
thank
joining
you.
us. You know how to get a hold of us.
And likewise.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, everybody, stay healthy and safe.
You
All
too.
right.
Thanks,
Thank
Jen.
you.